about what the future's like. I'm going to ask my first guest to come up. He's James Moody. He's the founder and CEO of 2Share. So this is the reason that you brought your stuff that we're going to do some sharing with. And he's going to talk about living in two worlds and understanding the stuff around us. Give us an intro to what 2Share is, and then later on he's going to come back and he's going to help organise the sharing. Please give him a round of applause. Welcome up. Thanks, James.
Excuse me, everybody. So good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure and an honour to come and talk to you about one of my favourite topics, the things around us. It's interesting, my background, I'm an electrical engineer, or an engineer in general, and it's very interesting when you really dig into it, what do engineers do? But they actually just build stuff. And in fact, when I was reflecting about my entire career, it's actually all been about trying to understand the things that we have around us and what we do with them. And as I was starting to do some work with 2Share, which I will share a little bit about in a second, I had actually had a very, you might say, deep insight. And that was actually that, ladies and gentlemen, we do not just live in one world. It might feel like you are in one world at this moment, but in actual fact, you are living in two worlds. You actually live in two worlds. The very first world is the world that, you know, we're probably very comfortable in. It's the one we actually evolved into. It's called the Biosphere. It's the world of us as biological entities, eating our food, drinking our drinks, the stuff that comes out the other end, bit of a shame, but you know, we have to do something with all of it. It's us, but it's actually us, as you might say, very clever monkeys running around this planet doing biological things, right? That's us in the Biosphere. But there is an entire other world that really didn't appear until maybe about 7,000 years ago. Got sort of turbocharged with this thing called the Industrial Revolution. And it's it's what you can call the technosphere. It's all the things that we use. It's when the clever monkeys suddenly worked out that if you use a stick and you sharpen a stick and then you make the stick out of bronze and then you make the stick out of steel and then you start to put microprocessors into the stick, it suddenly becomes an iPhone. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the technosphere. And I put it to you as maybe a starting point of really thinking about this world of stuff. That the very first, and by the way, you probably already realize this, I'm a total nerd, and not only a nerd, but a systems engineer of a nerd, so I have to break everything up. But if you really break stuff down into two things, right, there's the stuff that lives in the Biosphere, and there's the stuff that lives in the technosphere. And the first thing to do is really start thinking, and when we talk about things like sustainability, when we talk about other areas, actually let's treat those things slightly differently, because believe it or not, they are quite different entities in their own right. Let's start with the Biosphere. The Biosphere is great. You know, I really do enjoy my glass of wine, I enjoy the food that I have. As humans, believe it or not, we're pretty wasteful in the Biosphere, but our impact is not that great. Did you know that the biomass of humans is 1/10 the biomass of ants? Right? As a biological entities, we actually... Now, to feed that biomass of humans, believe it or not, we actually are very wasteful. Believe it, 40%, this is a very interesting figure, 40% of the food that gets produced does not make it into somebody's mouth on a worldwide basis. We are losing 40% of the food. Here's some statistics just from Australia about the food that goes into the waste bill, into the trash can. Believe it or not, on the average family in Australia throws over $1,000 worth of food every year in the trash in the trash can. You can sort of see that's $20. That all adds up to effectively a household en masse, and a lot of it is actually in the Biosphere. A household en masse actually throws out 3 stories worth of food, so you could fill a house with a 3-story house with the amount of waste that an average family throws out, and about half of that is food waste. So, as entities, we actually are quite wasteful, but believe it or not, the impact in the Biosphere, us as biological entities, is not actually that great. Particularly when we come to the other half of the equation, the technosphere. This, ladies and gentlemen, is actually where most of our impact, our full impact, actually occurs. The technosphere, as I mentioned, is also great. I do, you know, it's, and you know, it is the technosphere is full of wonderful inventions. Believe it or not, the technosphere in some ways is even more successful at penetrating many places than the biosphere. There are more mobile phones, or more people have access to a mobile phone in this world than have access to a toilet. Right? A toilet being largely a biosphere-based device. But interestingly, the technosphere is, you know, there's more access to Coca-Cola, you know, the containers of that, than necessarily access to fresh water. There's really very interesting things that we've done in the technosphere. There's also places where we actually live in the biosphere and the technosphere. We might not think about it, but that tap in our house actually does two functions, right? It has a biosphere function, which you use to drink, and it has a wonderful technosphere function. I also have I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. There's a wonderful technosphere function from the tap called clean children, clean clothes, right? That all sits in the technosphere, believe it or not. And again, when you start to realize that we live in these two worlds, so what am I getting from my tap? I'm getting, believe it or not, 2% of the water that comes into your home is for biosphere purposes. We consume about 2% of the water in our home. 98% of that water is actually used for technosphere purposes. You know, clean children, clean, you know, beautiful plants to look at. I suppose that's sort of biosphere, but it's mainly amenity. You know, clean clothes and so on. Right? We actually don't use it for potable. And this is where it then starts getting fascinating. Think about 2% in the biosphere versus 98% in the technosphere, right? We still purify 98% of that water to suit the 2% biosphere mechanism. And in fact, if we start to compare the two, the biosphere and the technosphere, that's where you realize that there's something going on. And so that's really, I started to dig very deeply into what's going on in the technosphere. And I came up with, in a musing one time, and it was actually a very boring meeting somewhere, I actually worked out that there's different types of things that we do in the technosphere. We have single-use items, right? Your disposable cups. We have multiple-use items, these things that we use more than once, maybe this jacket, but it still degrades a bit as I'm using it. We have tools, which are things like air conditioners, cars. Theoretically, they don't necessarily need to degrade. Why does a razor necessarily? I'm pretty sure that my whiskers are not quite as, you know, should be blunter than a razor. I'm not sure why it degrades, but it does, as we can see. Trinkets, which are things that have amenity value. They probably sit there and don't degrade at all. And then finally, services. And if we start to think about stuff, and you'll hear tonight about, you know, the circular economy, you'll hear about the shared economy and so on. Really, some of this is all about actually moving things up that hierarchy, because the further up that hierarchy you move, the lower your impact is. So, you know, we've been actually starting to see models where you can move from single use to multiple use. It's called a green bag. Moving from a single-use plastic bag to a multiple-use green bag. It's still not a tool yet, because the green bag, I've got a big pile of green bags that are starting to degrade. They don't happen. But interestingly, single-use to tools. You know, the keep cup is a very good example of where you go from the disposal space to the keep cup. Those things are pretty much indestructible. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but those keep cups are going to last for a long time, right? They're almost becoming a tool. They don't necessarily degrade with use. There's even more interesting things like, you know, many of you might have heard of interface, where we're starting to see, let's take a tool, such as carpet, or you might say it's a multiple-use item, let's try to turn it into, using a different model, into a service, right? How do you do that? Well, Interface, a carpet company, rents carpet. So they're not selling carpet anymore, they're selling the look and feel of carpet. GoGet, the car share company, realizes that you don't need the tool, you don't need the car, you actually need the service of mobility. Right? And eventually there's no reason why we couldn't be saying, hey, you know, a washing machine. Do you need a washing machine? No, you don't need a washing machine, you just need clean clothes. So why doesn't a company give you the washing machine and then charge you, 10 cents a wash? And I bet you if that started to happen, and then they started to, you know, stick detergent and so on in, you'd suddenly find that, hey, we're going to have detergentless washing machines, because they would be able to provide the service with less resource. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much, hopefully gives you a bit of an outline into some of the world of stuff. Interestingly, for me, the sort of segue into this whole space, and you know what we were then doing, and I think we're going to hear from Lauren and others around what happens is, if you really look at the world around us, okay, and you take the biosphere as one area to look at, but the stuff mostly being the technosphere, you actually do realize there's a huge amount of stuff around us. A huge amount of what they call in this collaborative consumption space, idle assets. Right? Idle assets being, look, we're all sitting here, many of you might have a car, who's driving the car? There's an idle asset. Right? There's lots of space, and that's what GoGet is basically monetizing. There's lots of space in homes. That's what Airbnb was monetizing. There's lots of cars driving around empty. That's what Uber is going to monetize. And really for us, one of the really most interesting things is how do you actually unlock all those idle assets? And that's really what I decided about a year and a half ago to dedicate the next 10 years at least of my life to, which is trying to find ways of unlocking the idle assets in people's homes. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but really, hopefully you can see that then the future for us is around two different, understanding those two worlds. And really the future being in the biosphere, it is going to be about recycling, it's going to be about recovering. But believe it or not, the good news is as biological entities, nothing we do is a one-way chemical reaction, right? We're all totally organic. It can all be recovered with just a little bit of energy. It's in the technosphere. That's where the interesting space occurs. And that's where things like reuse, how do we reuse the things in our home and find a new home for them? How do we shift to service models that actually decouple economic growth from the consumption of the resource? That is the space that I think is very fascinating and where we want to go into this stuff. So I think the future is very bright. I think the future is going to be very disruptive. And I look forward to hearing the other speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much.